Lorwyn. Chapter 6. Rhys lifted clear of the saddle as his mount effortlessly bounded over a mossy boulder. In that moment of weightless, unfettered flight, the disgraced elf forgot demotion and failure. He was simply a hunter, and this was his chase. As far as punishments go, he thought, this one shall not be so bad. Yet, on the far side of the age-worn rock, the servant shattered a rotten log and a thriving, unsuspecting anthril into mulch beneath her hooves. Rhys felt no noticeable impact, and needed to lean only slightly forward to urge his steed on at full gallop. Of all the treasures the blessed nation had wrung from the wilds of Lorwyn, the servants were the most magnificent. They were sleek and elegant, with overlong limbs that placed the servant's back anywhere from 10 to 15 feet off the ground on a typical ride. Their limber, stilt-like legs allowed them to negotiate the most treacherous woodland terrain without slowing their remarkable pace. These legs were improbably long, but this apparent awkwardness belied a flexible set of limbs far stronger than they appeared. Servants could quickly lift their bodies from the ground to full height and back again without breaking a sweat. To an onlooker, a sprinting servant navigating a large obstacle often resembled some strange insect or snake, not much so hurdling or climbing the impediment as flowing over it. Smooth foreheads gave way to soft fuzzy antlers both male and female servants sported. A servant's silky coat was a pale tapestry of woody brown and sunrise orange, and mature servants sported white, cat-like whiskers on their muzzles, lending their faces a noble air of wisdom and experience. Servants were highly prized among elf nobles, and had been for as long as anyone could remember. The gilt-leaf elves had hunted them for their beauty, and for the considerable challenge they posed. It was said that a servant was the only thing in the living world that could outrun an elf. In their wisdom, Rhys's blessed ancestors could not bring themselves to simply destroy something so beautiful, or so useful. They began to capture servants, not for their coats, but to domesticate them, to breed and tame them as mounts and draft animals. Rhys's steed crouched down and pounded the soil with its hooves. The trees blurred along his peripheral vision, and Rhys's joy cooled. The servant he rode was a fine specimen, a direct descendant of the original breeding stock, but it was at least a dozen generations removed from the wild. He surmised it had been bred in one of Nath's kennels in the east, which the Tersan had maintained for as long as Rhys could remember. 50 paces ahead and to the north, Nath himself rode a great smoke-grey servant, whose bloodline was clearly only a sire or two removed from the wild chargers of the Deepwood. Griffith was mounted on a similarly robust steed, riding 25 paces back in the position of honour to Nath's right. As newly demoted third in command, Rhys was relegated to the left, twice as far away from Nath as Griffith, as he led the reserve segment of the Tersan's assembled force. Rhys's servant straightened its legs to ascend a slight rise, and the improved vantage gave Rhys a full view of the prospective battleground as the elf legions surged forward. The Tersan, Griffith and Rhys were positioned at the head of their respective troops, composed of the combined might of the Gilt-Leaf's Nightshade, Hemlock, and Deathcap hunting packs. Only the officers were mounted. The rest of the scouts, archers, and rangers moved through the forest on their own 2 feet, in a deceptively chaotic pattern, carefully choreographed to corner every last scrap of ground, to root out the vermin they'd been ordered to harass. Nath's army was bearing down on the Porringer Valley, a broad lowland trough cut at the base of the Wonderwine River. Porringer was the ancestral home of the Ash Treefolk, who counted among their number some of the largest warriors and oldest sages in all of Lorwyn. Even though Porringer hosted far more of the latter, it was still one of the Ash folk's most secure strongholds. The trees were so numerous, it was impossible for any kind of sizable force to advance quickly by land or sky. Once an invader's slow progress roused the Ash to action, It would be a fight for every inch against 1,000 angry treefolk and their less mobile relatives. Indeed, Porringer had formidable defences when the treefolk were roused to action. However, those times were rare, and though he'd never personally seen the Ash in action, it sounded nothing like the orderly defense Rhys usually associated with the word defense. In fact, the valley was not really defended at all. The philosophical Ashfolk allowed anyone to come and go through Porringer at any time so long as the denizens of the valley itself were left more or less alone. The outer edges of Porringer's thick, endless groves were rife with criminals and vermin, outlaws from every tribe. Yet the treefolk never raised a complaint, much less their fists. So long as the visitors made no mischief and did no harm to anything of interest to the Ash, they were welcome to roam the valley for as long as they liked. Perhaps the community's surfeit of scholars and philosophers was behind this attitude. The valley's role as sanctuary caused nothing but strife for the gilt leaf. Bandits weren't the only fugitives hiding within Porringer. The place also was the last refuge for eye-blights and other disgraced elves. The valley was the only place Rhys had ever heard of where elves who had merely been disgraced did not slaughter eye-blights on sight, as was the custom. Boggarts lived here by the score, entire colonies squatting like rodents among the roots. Random gangs of the vicious little things would run and hide here whenever they had a cause to run and hide. The only thing they all had in common was respect for the Ashfolk, which kept the conflict within the valley to a minimum. Sanctuary for one was sanctuary for all, but anyone who started a fight that resulted in injury to a tree tended to disappear. Rhys heard a mournful birdsong and recognized a trail talk signal he'd been expecting. He squeezed the servant's rope-muscled neck, and the mount responded instantly, coming to a gentle stop. The Gilt-Leaf's quarry had come to Porringer, driven and herded here by the assembled might of the 3 full hunting packs. Nath's army could have overtaken the wild, blood-stained band in a matter of hours and overwhelmed them in the woods long before they ever reached the valley. But Nath had other ideas. The Tersan's plan, which he outlined to Griffith while pointedly ignoring Rhys, who kept waiting like a servant outside his command tent, was to drive the Boggart raiders all the way to the supposed safe haven of Porringer. To Griffith, Nath declared his determination to clean out the valley once and for all, to remove every last Boggart and villain infesting the place. It was a task that no exquisite had yet managed. Indeed, one that many would never attempt for fear of antagonizing the treefolk who lived here. Nath was dismissive, almost disdainful of this attitude, which he raised himself rhetorically, only to tear down and immediately dismiss. Since the Ash did not object to the Boggart's presence, he reasoned, they could not possibly object to the Boggart's removal, so long as the Ashfolk weren't directly affected. Griffith properly asked the question Rhys would have asked before leading warriors into such a battle. To where shall we remove them, Tersan? Nath brushed the query aside with a mysterious, dry chuckle. Once we have succeeded, he said, I will enact a new initiative, in which you will play a central part, you see. I believe it is long past time the Gilt Leaf established a permanent outpost near here. The Tersan lowered his horns and fixed his cold, grey eyes on Griffith. Which, unless one is far dimmer than one has appeared thus far, is the answer one needs. Nath raised his head and turned back. Sufficient? More than sufficient, Tersan. Griffith's voice was sharp and hungry. Excellent, in fact, if I may speak freely. You may. Rhys was not so sanguine. If Nath intended to encroach on Porringer, not only the Ash, but all the treefolk on the High Council would surely protest. Porringer's warrior Ashfolk contingent might even be roused from the heart of their sacred grove to defend their home. But Nath had not risen to the highest ranks of the elves' ruthless hierarchy by thinking small or shrinking from a challenge. If he cleaned out Porringer, He would be in an extremely strong position to establish and defend an outpost here. He would add a large, valuable piece of unclaimed territory to his holdings. Nath would also control all traffic and commerce between the Gilt-leaf Wood and western Lorwyn. Rhys shook such thoughts from his head as Griffith approached. Griffith's huge brindle servant trotted as silently as sunlight, and though its eyes were fixed on Rhys, Griffith kept his face turned away from his old friend and comrade. Rhys noted with satisfaction that the troops of the combined packs elegantly altered their maneuvers without altering their tactics, as his fellow commander drew up next to him. Nath wanted me to make sure you understand your role here, Griffith said, his eyes carefully locked on the foliage above his own right shoulder. I do, Rhys answered. I am to hold the reserve force ready until he signals me. Griffith turned and glared. And you will comply without delay? Of course. Of course what? Of course, Rhys said. Griffith turned away once more and stared ahead, his position in the saddle indicating his subordinate was dismissed. Rhys hesitated. What he was about to do was still frowned upon by most elves. Sudden, empathetic intrusion was rude, and in practical terms could sometimes get the intruder stabbed, shot, or dropped from a great height. But he needed to communicate his unease to Griffith. Rhys felt with a growing certainty that this raid was a very bad idea. Griffith, I must speak with you. Rhys saw Griffith slap a hand to the side of his head with a start, almost losing his balance. The proximity of the mighty Silverwoods made Rhys's thoughts reverberate inside both their skulls like a Cranog's bell tower in a thunderstorm. The message travelled along a one-way channel to the other who had not learned the techniques Rhys had mastered with Culfanor. Griffith could not respond in the same way, another factor that had made the intrusion risky. Griffith scowled, silent but furious, at Rhys's terrible and intrusive breach of etiquette. Rhys chose his next words as carefully as he could. This attack, it's a bad strategy. We don't even know why those boggarts went mad. We don't know if they came from here. They might have just been passing through. Attacking may make the problem worse. It may drive more desperate boggarts out into the woods. Not to mention the outroar from the tree folk. Only you give a leaf about the tree folk's opinion, Griffith snarled, which I count as more evidence to your unfitness, even for your current position. As for the boggarts, Griffith grinned, with a predatory sneer that had never disquieted Rhys until this moment. It did now. When this is over, it won't matter how those vermin react. They can't go mad when they're all dead. All? Rhys barely managed to bite out the word when a call from ahead snapped his mouth shut. Maintain your positions! Nath's voice came through the trees, clear and strong. It was remarkable that he was not using trail talk. His voice was loud, though he was not shouting, and Rhys knew the words hardly carried beyond his own ears, a rhetorical skill that served the Tisan well on the battlefield, or on the hunt. Nath's verbal proclamation gave the proceedings a grander, more formal air that Rhys found more disquieting than any empathic contact. If you must prattle like a kifkin, do so when your duty is complete, the Tisan called, and do it far from my ears. Griffith's face flushed with embarrassment, and without a word he dug his heels into the servant's side and cantered back to his place at the head of the right flank. Rhys was sorry to see him go, but even sorrier at Griffith's reaction. His friend's promotion, though probably temporary, was clearly of utmost importance to him, with Griffith technically being Rhys's superior. Nath's continued approval became the lifeline to greater prominence within the packs, perhaps even to the distinctive Tisan's tattoo that all the hunters hoped to wear. Stacked against such a weight, the idea of continuing their long friendship was woefully inadequate. While these thoughts raced through his head, another section of his mind, the hunter, continued to search the trees for prey or large predators. As Rhys's contemplative thoughts turned to the well-known fact that Nath, like most powerful elves, was one to hold a grudge. He saw movement in the trees, movement that should have not been there. Quickly and silently he double-checked. The overlooked teams were in the canopy where they belonged. The combined forces moved forward, dozens of stealthy elf hunters slipping silently through the trees. Griffith was once more leading the right flank with Nath at the tip of the lead formation. They were both focused forward, alert and on the attack, ready to fall on the enemy before then. So they did not see what Rhys saw. A lone boggart emerging from a hole it had dug for itself. It was the colour of wet ashes, and unarmed. Its body clad in a filthy black loincloth, a layer of mud, and nothing more. It rubbed its dirt-encrusted eyes sleepily until it noticed the elves moving away from it, towards the valley. The boggart reacted like a frightened hare when it saw Rhys looking at him, freezing in place, and hoping a lack of further movement would give the hunter no reason to look again. Perhaps it hoped to blend back in with the shadows, but Rhys easily kept it in sight. For a moment he considered calling to Griffith. He did not, instead reminding himself that he could still expect the rank-and-file hunters in his flank to follow his orders. Using only hand signals, he sent word through the pack, with instructions to pass the information up to Nath and Griffith. Then Rhys sent a pair of hunters around the silverwood to capture the boggart for interrogation before it could raise an alarm. His hunters were up to the challenge. They doubled back and crept around the silverwood, flanking the boggart on each side. It didn't even notice them, as they drew their swords and struck as one, twice skewering the grubby little beast where it stood. Rhys muffled a warning cry. "Fools," he thought. "We needed him alive." Nath's whisper, sharp as wind shear, cut through Rhys's head. "Rhys?" The mounted Tessan had materialized in front of Rhys, his eyes wide and angry. "What is the meaning of this?" "My Tessan," Rhys said, lowering his head. He spoke quickly, pointing at the dead boggart. "That creature was buried here for a reason, I believe, to spy on us. We sought to trap the boggarts here, but they may in turn be laying a trap for us. And I am to fear the defences of vermin. Should I also fear to kick an anthill, Rhys, lest the insects bite my tender feet?" Nath snorted, then thoughtfully pinched the end of one horn between his thumb and forefinger. "That rotting hunk of flesh was obviously a stray. We're here to put such strays down." "Honoured Tessan," Rhys said, "I speak a little of what these things call a language. Let us take one alive. Let me interrogate the creature. If we are being led into a trap..." The Tessan drove a fist into the center of Rhys's chest, knocking him backwards off his mount. Rhys landed heavily and rolled, mindful that he should not rise until Nath gave him permission to do so, or risk another blow. Breathing heavily, Rhys noted that Nath could have easily landed a blow on his face, but hadn't. Even the Tessan was not angry enough to mar Rhys's features and make an eye-blight of him. Not yet. "Do you question me?" Nath said, his eyes closing to slits, his hand dangling near the hilt of his silver longsword. "Do you, Rhys?" Though he could still barely breathe, Rhys forced himself to straighten and respond. "Reconnaissance, then, Ter," he managed. "Knowledge is the sheathed claw that strikes the unwary and unworthy." Nath grimaced at having his own words he had used with raw, inexperienced hunters, thrown back at him. But after a few seconds he nodded. "You speak well when you quote your betters. Very good. You have 3 minutes to scout ahead. Address your concerns in that time, for in 3 minutes we are moving into the valley." "Yes, Tessan," Rhys said. He climbed up onto the servant's back. "You now have 2 minutes and 55 seconds, Nath replied, and without another word turned his servant and guided it back to the head of the pack. 2 minutes 50, Griffith said. "I heard him, Griff," Rhys muttered to himself. He tapped his heels into the servant's ribs and the live creature sprang forward. The elf scanned the ground as he rode, searching for other buried boggarts. or other holes that had been dug and refilled with sleeping sentries inside. He saw nothing. Either the boggarts had learned to hide their efforts, or there were no more hidden guards. Rhys rode within view of the ash tree line below. He had to turn away before he was spotted, but he could not go back to Nath without something. Rhys pulled his servant up short and urged it to move slowly. The elf's sharp eyes saw hundreds of figures moving in the haze. He counted his remaining time to himself, each second an agonizing eternity, as he struggled to make sense of what he saw. The boggarts of Porringer were bustling, but they were not preparing defences, nor were they massing for an attack. They were standing in clusters, building small bonfires, setting up tables. Most were talking and some were even singing. Rhys actually heard sour harmonies lifting up from the valley. Wandering around the middle of the group of boggarts, Rhys recognized an older boggart matron, Auntie Fum. Realization dawned, and Rhys felt a surge of purpose. These boggarts were from Auntie Fum's warren, and that was all the proof he needed. The servant responded to his gentle nudge and spun about. Together they raced back to the approaching elf army, silent but for the wind in Rhys's ears. Nath waited like a statue, not even deigning to acknowledge Rhys's approach. Rhys exhaled sharply, relief flooding into his mind. He had made it with 30 seconds to spare. "Time's up," the Tersan said, daring Rhys to point out that it was in fact not. When Rhys didn't, Nath nodded. "Your report." The boggarts aren't behaving as they should be," Rhys began. "That much is clear," Nath said. Rhys said with all the patience he could muster. "They belong to Auntie Fum, the Fum Warren. Alone among boggart tribes has never given the nation any cause to chastise it. They have farms, they trade with the Kifkin and the Merrow. The raiders we hunted were not from this tribe." "So you say, but they could be. Suppose for a moment that you are mistaken. Would not that prove the depths of boggart treachery? To abuse the protection Porringer provides." "Treachery?" Rhys blurted. "These are boggarts. I hardly think they have a master plan." "Your thoughts mean little to me. All you've proven is the necessity of the lesson we are about to dispense." Nath swept an arm ahead of him. "Pack, hold. Prepare to strike on my command." The Tersan scowled at Rhys. "Close to me, both of you. The reserve force can mind itself for now. Rhys, I want you near. I will personally see you fulfill your duty. You will relearn what it is to lead, or I will see you dead." Nath kicked into his servant's haunches, and the gangly steed dropped into a crouching gallop. Rhys and Griffith quickly followed suit. They broke into the edge of the grove half a minute later, and Nath reined his mount to a halt. Rhys and Griffith flanked him on the edge of the rocky cliff overlooking the busy boggart gathering below. "Look at them," Rhys said as his eyes took in the crowds of babbling, cackling, buzzing boggarts. "These boggarts are not a threat." The boggarts milled around in groups of 2 or 3, scrabbling through tents, hovels, and shacks as they continued to sing their horribly off-key songs. At least 50 boggarts had stripped away all totems and scraps of clothing that marked their tribal affiliation, and they danced in noisy circles around the trio of large fires. As Rhys watched, a boggart several feet away from the fire heaved a jawbone into the air. It was at least as big as the boggart that threw it, and appeared to have been wrenched from a river croc. Even at this distance, Rhys spotted a patch of green scales still affixed to the bone. Boggarts closer to the fire caught it and heaved it again. This time it landed in the fire with a noisy sizzle and snakes of black smoke. "Look at them," Nath sneered. "I see them clearly, roiling like a swarm of insects readying to spread death and plague." "You don't understand," Rhys said. "Usually there are only a few boggarts among the ash." "So?" Nath shrugged. "Today we enjoy a much wider range of targets." "Rhys said, losing his temper for a split second. Between what you see now and what I saw earlier, I estimate there are at least 300 to 500 boggarts down there. I would stake my reputation as a hunter." The indignant Tersan snorted, but let Rhys continue. "The boggarts in the valley are not planning a murder or anything else." "Why is that?" Nath asked. "They are in the middle of the most important festival, the feast of—" Rhys had to think for a moment. The boggart word was a rare compound form. "Yes," Nath said impatiently. "Footbottom. The feast of Footbottom." "Really?" "Yes, Ter. Auntie Thumb's followers always participate. It's an annual Warren reunion of sorts." Rhys pointed to the fires. "Boggarts from all over the region come here to Porringer, where they know they'll be safe. They've done it for generations. Most of the boggarts here aren't bandits, but celebrants. They are not a threat." "Boggarts in large numbers are always a threat." Nath's angry expression turned exasperated, with a touch of disgust. "I know all about this Thumb's ridiculous little festival. Why else did you imagine we're here if not to take advantage of the largest gathering of boggarts in the entire region?" Rhys remembered Griffith's hungry sneer. His chest went numb, and he stammered. "We can't attack them, Ter. No, not now, not here." "That is not your decision." "These aren't the boggarts we've been hunting," Rhys said, struggling to maintain control. It was the only argument he had left. "There's no sense to it. And if the fight spreads to the Ashfolk—" "You are a coward, and you insult hunters of the finest packs in the gilt leaf with your insinuation. Even if you are correct," Nath said, "the raiding boggarts must be punished, even if we have to kill every boggart in this forest to get them." Without turning from Rhys, he bellowed, "Hark! Take strike positions." "There!" Rhys shouted as the assembled pack formed up along the cliffside, assembling in perfect formation to sweep down the wide path leading to the camp. "This is a—" "You will remember your place," Nath bellowed. "Now, get back to your command and prepare to engage the enemy on my signal." The boggarts still danced around their blazing fires and sang their songs. They babbled with their kinfolk beside crude tables mounded with more food than the average boggart got in a month. Rhys's jaw locked. There was nothing he could do. "Yes, Ter," he said. He prodded his servant and sprinted back to his position at the head of the reserves. But he craned his head to watch the Tersen behind him. When he arrived, Rhys signaled his troops to stand ready. Nath's voice echoed loudly through the woods. "Archers," the Tersan said, and a line of arrows snapped into place. "Ignite." On Nath's command, the arrowheads combusted in a flash. "Gilt leaf hunters," he called. "My hunters. There are to be no survivors. We have an infestation here, and it must be cleansed. The boggart raiders and their cretinous progeny are below, and I say none shall leave this valley alive. I know you brave sons and daughters of the blessed nation will allow nothing less." The Tersen produced a glittering coil of polished gold and held it in his upraised fists. "That said," he shouted with a wicked smile, "if the boggart's matriarch herself is present, 1,000 threads of gold to the hunter who brings me her head." It was to the elves' credit that they stifled their cheers, issuing only impressed murmurs. Nath maintained his predatory sneer. "No survivors," he repeated, sounding like one waking from a beautiful dream. He turned on his lieutenants with a bloodthirsty glare. "No mercy. Now, execute." "Fire," Griffith ordered. A dozen of boggarts died without ever realizing they were in danger. Their siblings and cousins within 10 feet quickly caught on. However, when the flame-tipped arrows exploded in a shower of boiling boggart blood and burning boggart flesh, this sizzling shower of gore in turn ignited a fire that quickly spread to every tent, shack, hovel, and lean-to nearby. The flames fed off the arrow-grass projectiles and the moonglove in which they'd been dipped, adding enough poison to the oily black smoke that curled into the air to cause several more boggarts to drop to their knees and tear at their own eyes in agony. Griffith turned to Rhys as Griffith rode into the newly born battle. It was up to Rhys to deliver the final blow, to sweep in at Nath's bidding and launch the final prong of the attack against whatever hapless survivors endured the initial charge. If nothing else, Rhys would ensure that those boggarts who fell to his hunters would die quickly and cleanly, not choking on their own noxious blood as they fled the horror around them. The boggarts as a species did not deserve mercy, but Nath's planned massacre was beneath the dignity of the nation, let alone Rhys's own. Nothing could convince Rhys he was wrong, and Nath's willingness, even eagerness to launch this attack on the creatures at this time went against Rhys's every instinct. And so Rhys buried instinct. Another second of delay would only bring further rebuke. Rhys drew his sword and raised it overhead. Hemlock, Nightshade, and Deathcap, strike now, hunters of the Gilt Leaf. Strike!